talking about how to successfully innovate, fusing functional and non-functional requirements. Again, this is a topic that, it may seem tedious at times. It may seem, already common knowledge. And probably there's going to be things that I'm going to showcase in the slides over the next 30 minutes that you've already seen 1,000 times. Well, that's good. Maybe there's a chance that, somewhere along these lines, some of these slides are going to trigger some new thoughts. And that's really what we're really trying to foster over here. All right, so let's get into it. Just 5 seconds here because I see that there's a bunch of familiar faces, but there's also some new faces that we just haven't had a chance to really properly introduce here. So, Envision Blockchain is a consulting and custom application development organization. You can consider us like a blockchain specific system integrator. We're going from left to right. We provide consulting and custom development services. We like to leverage modern cloud solutions, and our consultative approach really is around, providing these different educational type of workshops. So just a quick little plug, if anyone has been to the webinars that we put on in the past, we are members of the Enterprise Ethereum Alliance. That's a nonprofit organization. It's a member-driven organization aiming to create, standards within the Ethereum community. What's most relevant specific to this webinar is that there's currently a live survey going on right now. So within the Enterprise Ethereum Alliance, called the EEA for short, there's different working groups and special interest groups, and one of them is the Mainnet Use Cases Task Force. We're sitting on there in Envision Blockchain along with a number of other organizations that I'm sure everyone has heard about before. Essentially, there's a live survey that's going on. It's been live for past couple weeks now. We're hoping to close it up sometime in the first week of May. We've been getting some really great participation. And this survey is really about identifying the requirements that could later be shared with the community and really use as a starting point for designing and building technical solutions that fill any existing functional gaps. So we're going to take little excerpts of this later down the slides, but just to give you an idea of the survey, we really recommend all the people that are on this webinar right now, go to this website, bit.ly/EEA survey. It'll take you right there. It takes, if you really fill it out thoroughly, let's say about half an hour, maybe 40 minutes. So, it's not that, much of a, point and shoot type of a survey. There is some thought process that's put into it, and we'll kind of explain why. But essentially the survey at a glance is we first start talking about the barriers and the challenges. Then we start talking about the general type of, use case descriptions. And then the last piece talks about performance, right? Transaction requirements, core level, application level, etc. And you could see already where we're kind of getting to this purpose of the presentation today, right? Because when you're describing your use cases, when you're describing your performance, this is really a mix of different type of functional and non-functional requirements. And in a really perfect world, and we will reiterate this later on in the presentation, that really your non-functional requirements should be additions onto your functional requirements, right? So one says what it must do, the other one talks about how it needs to get done. And we'll go further deep into that, right? But now, obviously, we're talking about blockchain technology here. So this is meant to be decentralized, distributed, right? Public, open, yada, yada. So, you can think about the ways to gather these functional, non-functional requirements very similar to the way that you're building traditional centralized applications. So, if you're thinking about building an application that's not blockchain related, don't worry, right? You could still use these methodologies for that. It's just that the group of stakeholders that we'll try to define over the next couple slides, it's going to increase, or it could actually decrease still when developing blockchain solutions, and we'll explain why. So, you know, this is kind of a funny slide, right? You know, you think about, you know, someone's asking you, you know, how's your project going? And if anyone has played Mario Brothers, this is probably a familiar scene, right? You got these, you know, fire lines here that are coming from all angles. And this is really an interesting way to define, you know, how's your project going, you know, because you know you have these different forces that are coming at you really from all different angles, right? So in order to have a successful project, you really have to navigate these you know, Mario fireballs, if you will, to get to the very end and jump on that flag, right? Everyone knows how that game goes. But if we kind of define what it is that these, you know, fireballs are that we have to kind of jump around, you know, we can kind of define it this way, where, you know, the first set of things that we need to juggle is market conditions. This is real, you know, because the application that you want to build, or what the value proposition is supposed to be, or even how to collect the different groups of stakeholders really is going to change based on different conditions. For example, globalization, right? This changed the way that we approach projects entirely. Having to come up with a business strategy to be able to have wider margins. This is always what we're looking for, right? But what if there's new regulatory considerations that come in? It's gonna throw a curveball, right? And this is kind of some of the things that those that are in the blockchain industry understand, that the regulatory considerations are serious and they need to be taken that way at the same time. You know, likewise, we also have these new business models that are coming on, right? How are we going to monetize the products that we're putting to the market? We have economic risks. We're all in this together right now, right? Where no one could have foreseen the economic challenges that are happening in today's times. And it's in these times that is going to make a company pivot one way or another, right? You have investors, you have user trends, etc. Another thing to watch out for is obviously business outcomes. And business outcomes could be, you know, it could overlap with market conditions, but you can also consider it in terms of, you know, what are you looking to do with your platform? What are you looking to do with your application? What sort of branding are you looking to come out with? You know, and this is something that is really important, because along with your brand also comes this culture of innovation. And we'll get to that in a couple slides again. But, you know, as we get to these decentralized models that, you know, that we all know and we love, there's some organizations that are more prone to risk and some that are risk averse. So being able to understand and pivot based on, you know, the market conditions, the business outcomes is all very important. Managing expectations with service level agreements, SLAs, you know, being able to remain lean, operational efficiency, these are all parts of this whole business outcome, right? And then we have these smaller subsets where, you know, within market conditions and business outcomes, you have now your strategy. This needs to be considered even before getting into a project. Where do we align? How do we prioritize our programs, right? So for those that are keen with project management and program management, right? A program is really a collection of different projects that feed that same pipeline, if you will. So prioritizing your program and then prioritizing your projects within that program is something that really needs to be done in the beginning. We'll go through that and how that could be achieved. But right, we're just setting the stage over here, because as you can see, there's a lot of things to dip and dodge along your way. You also have execution, right? So what good is strategy without an execution plan? And an execution is really, you know, it's simple. We have three basic things that we can think about while we're executing really anything, not just a project, just execution in general. Where are our tools? How are we going to communicate? And how are we going to accept what we're doing? How are we going to measure it? Where are the metrics, right? And then we also have this whole operationalize, right? This is, how do we support what we're building? How do we iterate what we're building, right? So this is kind of the very high level view as to what's going on. And, I want to be mindful of time. Again, we have just so much content to pack in here. So I'm going to try to keep this moving. But, this is a really interesting slide, because we start taking a look at the way that projects are being put together, or the way that a business is being put together. And we have this cost of misalignment where, I like to call this kind of the snowball effect, where, if you take a look at any project, you have this planning phase. And if you're misaligned in the planning phase, it's going to cost, but it's not going to cost as much as the design phase, right? So as you're going through designs, and as you're, not aligned on what the right priorities are, right? This is why we were saying that the prioritization, the strategy, the market conditions, et cetera, right? It's going to be, exponentially more expensive as you go through this whole, let's just call it life cycle. And then obviously it becomes, however many X to when you start building, and then if we want to take it to the last one, after something is launched, imagine having everything seem like we're good, we're planning, everything's fine, the design is fine, the build, okay. And then all of a sudden now we launch, and then during the launch, there's all misalignment. During the launch, the regulatory conditions were wrong, economic things happen. And I think that we've experienced something like this right now. How many companies can you think about right now that during this launch didn't plan for this sort of economic turbulence that we're in? The cost of misalignment doesn't necessarily have to mean that it's really the people's fault, right? We, in this whole COVID pandemic, there's a lot of organizations, I'm not going to put percentages out here because I don't know, but there's a lot of organizations that just weren't aligned with this sort of, economic mitigation strategy or pandemic strategy. And, the cost is there. But let's just move forward and let's figure out how we can actually put this all together, right? So the plan, the design, the build, the launch, this is a very, stereotypical, generic way to really talk about, what's really the life cycle of any project. So let's take a look at what's involved in the plan phase, right? How are we going to get all of our stakeholders aligned? And just keep in mind, that, according to this stat right here, that 50% of all organizations don't have standard processes. 42% have no established planning process. 41% aren't encouraging employees to build organizational capabilities. 33% cite difficulties in monitoring plans and making adjustments when needed. And 54% do not measure what matters, right? So this is a problem. And again, this is all aligned with getting everything, lack of better words, aligned at the beginning. And what makes it even more difficult is when we're talking about these decentralized applications where we have multiple stakeholders from cross organizations. We also want to take into account the users. We want to take into account the admins, the network participants, so on and so forth, right? Not having these sets of standards and governance and processes, it could really, make things more difficult further down the road. So how do we do this, right? Well, let's just talk about setting up from the very beginning. So there's something called the CMMI, which is the Capabilities Maturity Model Integration. And this really just, we don't need to spend a lot of time talking about every single aspect over here, but there's 5 different levels that every organization could go through. You go through the first phase, which is the initial, which is basically, look, you're being reactive. You're not being proactive. You're just basically saying, okay, we're going to go forward and we're going to make changes as it goes. Every organization starts out this way. Even some large organizations stay that way, but we always have to mature, right? So level 2 talks about being managed. being able to have this process categorized for projects, and we have to manage it. We could talk about how in a second. Level 3 talks about having this organization that is being proactive, which kind of gets you into level 4, which is being now quantitatively managed, having the right sets of measurements so that you know exactly where you're getting to. Level 5 is called optimizing. We'll get to that a little bit later. I think that that's the key focus. That's really, the end in mind. And really, there's 4 different categories at the very beginning that every organization needs to think about, right? Stephen Covey start with the end in mind. So we have these 4 major categories. You have doing, managing, enabling, and improving. And just going really quickly into each one of these, right? So when you're doing, you're ensuring your quality, you're providing the engineering and development products, what they need, from technical solutions to product integration. You have peer reviews, you have quality assurance processes, you're delivering and managing services, you have this delivery management, you have this strategic oversight management. Then you're also selecting and managing suppliers because you might not have all the capabilities in-house. Taking it one step level, now we have to manage, right? So this is, how do we plan our work? How do we manage the business resilience? How do we manage the workforce? And this is also managing your cross-organizational partners as well. We'll get into some of the tooling. Moving forward, now we have to enable, right? So we have to support the implementation. This comes from configuration management, decision analysis, casual analysis, which is kind of, eyeballing, but still making sure that we're keeping track of what's important. And obviously moving forward to improving, right? So this is where we are supporting the habits and moving forward, providing the right sets of governance, this implementation infrastructure, improving the performance, so on and so forth. And that whole the CMMI capabilities matrix, what that really helps you is just, do this right here. Evaluate your readiness before you get into anything. So again, involve your internal and external stakeholders. It's simple, but it's not always done. Have this culture correction. So if you know that the market conditions are going one way, and you know what the trends are, and your company may not foster that level of innovation or that level of change, right? This is like the innovator's dilemma, that classic book talking about people that are afraid that they're going to get their neck chopped off if they stick it out, but they know exactly where the innovation needs to happen. Have that discussion and do it in a way that allows that fostering of innovation. And then also making sure that there's this right program and project prioritization so that we're doing the right things at the right time, spending, the right sets of resources that really aligns. And this whole project and program prioritization is all about alignment and obviously establishing the governance. So, okay, great. We're planned. We think that we're ready to go. We know that we have a use case. We think that we have aligned everything. Let's now get to work, right? So the next phase is to design. And typically, who's involved in the design phase? It's really simple, right? You have your executive leadership that's at the top. There's typically a steering committee that's formed of these different stakeholders. It could be from cross organizations. You could have, let's just say someone downstream, midstream, upstream, different network partners, right? I'm trying to think about, in the decentralized nature, that's how it works, but that could still be in traditional applications as well. And most importantly, who else is involved? You have your functional design team and you have your technical design team. Sometimes it's said that one side is the business, the other side is IT, but I'm not going to make that, I'm not going to make that line in the sand. That's not needed here, because IT folks should be considered about business and business folks should be considering IT. Realistically, we have our stakeholders, right? So I'm not going to call that your steering committee. Let's just call that the stakeholders. So, really quickly, I see this time and time again, and I fall into habit over here. But what's the difference between functional requirements and non-functional requirements? This is something that always needs to be kind of outlined and addressed. So the functional requirements, it's actually quite simple, but it's defining what the product should do. What should you do? Versus a non-functional requirement talks about how the product should work. So just to put it into, some sort of a side-by-side analysis, we have this functional versus non-functional requirements, where on the functional side, it's typically captured in a use case, right? And we're going to go through how we can capture that next. But then a non-functional requirement, it's captured as a quality attribute. This is where we talk, we in the blockchain where we always talk about transactions per second, or we talk about, finality time or things like that. But those are the two major distinctions. Functional, we talk about product features, while non-functional, we talk about product properties, right? What is it built? What are the attributes and what are the properties of how it's built? Functional talks about the user requirements, while non-functional talks about the user's expectations and experience. Functional describes what the product does. Again, describes the product properties would be non-functional. But let's just keep it simple, right? Typically, if you find yourself using a verb, that's a functional requirement versus an attribute, that's typically going to be a non-functional requirement. Again, it's still easy to confuse what's the difference. So, you could just go to Wiki, you type in non-functional requirement. We're not going to spend time reading through what these are, but you could see from accessibility, adaptability. You also hear, if it usually ends in ility, right? ILITY, that's typically a non-functional requirement. Extensibility, exploitability, so on and so forth, right? So just talking about this EEA use case task force Mainnet survey, just to give you examples of how we capture both functional and non-functional requirements that later during these use groups, right, we're going to be, during the working groups, we're going to be assessing the responses. One of them is please describe your application use case involving Mainnet in as much detail as possible. Then we talk about what systems does your use case need to integrate with. If you have a preferred architectural stack in mind, use this for this use case, please explain. We include questions like how many write transactions per year do you anticipate for your use case? And do you have any service level agreements that need to be met for your use case? Really, in short, we're looking at filtering this by the different use case and finding the commonalities between all of these. So how do we have these different methodologies, or rather, what methodologies are involved during this sort of design phase? Well, during a use case analysis, what we found very helpful is to have this journey map, where this is an example of a public registry, oversimplified journey map, where in the upper left, define your stakeholders. In the upper right, define your outcomes. And then we go through the different phases per different stakeholder, right? And obviously, as you move from one phase until the third phase, phase 1, 2, and 3, there's pain points that happen. And you want to capture these pain points in what we call the emotion line. And these pain points are literally the points that we try to improve when we're coming up with our use case. So then in the lower left, this is how you come up with your opportunities. And on the lower right, this is where you have your NFRs, your non-functional requirements, and your metrics that need to uncover. In fact, these are the metrics that you can measure over time to make sure that things are actually built to support this emotion line. Another design methodology is a process flow, where on the left, right, we have an ocean freight logistics type of use case, and on the right, we have a procurement type of use case. And the one on the right might be a little bit more difficult to see, but the one on the left, that you could see that it goes through these different stages, if you will, or states, from state 1 all the way through state 11, and all the different, things that could happen, from situations being rejected to amended. And if you look even deeper into it, you can see the actors that are involved. Another design methodology, for example, is architecture diagram. So here's an example of an incentive program. And here that you could see, you know, what are the different deployment considerations? What are the different models that need to be from multi-tenant to single tenant? What are the different components, such as what ledger is involved and what sort of contracts are involved and so on and so forth, and what databases need to happen and what sort of integrations and what sort of, you know, communication, authorization messages need to be sent. These kind of architecture diagrams really help define not just the functional, but also the non-functional as well. Something else that's helpful is mockups and prototypes, where you could see, you know, on the left-hand side, you have a mockup, it's black and white, but what it's supposed to do is supposed to help you just come up with really simple ideas so that you can get the stakeholders start to get their juices flowing. On the right is a prototype. They could be clickable. There can be all sorts of different, you know, colors and branding, et cetera, that really helps move the stakeholders to acceptance. So all of these different methodologies that I was just going into, it really talks about this whole thing, right? And this is an example of a real simple private blockchain, right? So you have all your components from an ERP to the databases, to the integrations, to the UI layers, the blockchain, so on and so forth. And obviously in the private blockchain, there you have your network participants. Now, imagine going through all these exercises with the companies in the yellow and the companies in the blue and the companies in the red, and just how time consuming that could be, where if you were to leverage, let's say, a public blockchain, all you need to worry about is your own components and your own sets of requirements. We can get into why that's important over the, you know, with follow-up calls and discussions, but essentially it's really simple. The public blockchain simplifies things, simplifies the type of requirements that need to happen, right? We can get into that a little bit more offline. In the build phase, and I'm going to go through the next couple of slides. I'm just trying to be mindful of time over here. But really simple requirements, traceability matrix, right? We're not going to get into the tooling of the build, but just all the requirements that we just discussed earlier, from you know, the architecture to the components to the functional requirements to non-functional requirements. A simple Excel document goes a long way, helps people stay in the loop, what's been tested, what's been approved, everyone gets on the same page. Different software, for example, like Azure DevOps that we're showing the screenshot on the bottom, they have a requirements traceability built into the software. But again, no need to get fancy. Pen and paper does just the same thing. We just want to put this here, that part of the build phase also with DevOps practices are really important. We're not going to get into this. There's a whole separate webinar that we put up that talks about how different stakeholders have different code approvals and, you know, different environments, sandbox environments, test environments, production environments. We're not going to get into that. Just know that there's other pieces of content that we put out for that fits right within that build phase. And last but not least is the launch phase. And the next slide might seem a little bit intimidating, but it's really simple. And it really does a great job recapping really everything that we just discussed. And this is the last slide over here. But really, you know, from start to finish, if anyone's familiar with the SAFe methodology, is the Scaled Agile Framework. And really what it does is it takes this whole lean methodology and agile methodology for product development and release management. And it really talks about everything that we just discussed, right? So on the left-hand side, you can see that we talk about our agility, our portfolio management, our prioritization, team and technical ability, continuous learning culture, so always keeping up with trends. This is applicable to both enterprises and governments. You can see the different, you know, actors that we have, from epic owners, enterprise architects, business owners, cross-organization owners, etc. But now we get into this whole, if you look at it from left to right, from top to bottom, you have your strategic themes, which is, the market conditions, the business outcomes, your portfolio vision, what's your roadmap in the future. Moving on to your Kanban boards, you should be able to have this backlog of all the work that needs to get done. You have your budgets, and then you create your epics, right? Your epics are kind of your big overarching themes of what needs to get done. And as you're developing out these sort of epics, you have these key performance indicators that, if you have design thinking with customers in mind, as you start to develop and deliver, you should be able to have this continuous exploration, continuous integration, and continuous deployment model that continuously answers your customers' pain points so that you can release on demand. You can release as the information is, or as the products need to be released, in a way that really speaks to the customer, right? So customer, customer, customer. That's the most important thing all the time. And that always needs to be front and center when you're developing out your products, your applications, even if the customer is internal, right? Even if you're building an internal business application. But if you're not familiar with the SAFe methodology, I definitely recommend that you take a deeper dive into it. It really puts a nice methodology for, to operate as if you're a large organization, even if you're not. And even large organizations still can benefit from this, because this really puts the entire hierarchy of everyone that's involved all onto one plane. So, again, just a little bit of plug from us. As a system integrator in the space, we help out from, ideation, use case assessments, all the way through solution design, solution development, implementation support, post go live support, so on and so forth. And obviously with this webinar here, we're talking about more on the functional and technical requirement side, and making sure that your solutions are designed appropriately. Really appreciate everybody for joining. Thank you again. We provide these sort of thought leader presentations on a monthly basis. So please, keep checking our website, www.envisionblockchain.com, and subscribe to our email list. This is how you get notified before anybody else on any of these virtual events that we have happening, and hopefully that we can get out of this quarantine so we can continue doing the live seminars. And again, thank you everyone. Stay safe, stay healthy, and we'll be talking to you soon. Thank you.